What if the ships weren't preserved to remember, but to contain something that should never surface again? Steel hulls, iron silence, names etched in brass and glory. But listen, really listen, and you'll hear it. Beneath the tour guide scripts and polished decks, there's a pulse. Slow, heavy, watching. These vessels weren't just saved from rust. They were chained to piers like sleeping beasts. The USS Missouri holds more than surrender. Aurora fired more than a blank shot. Queen Mary's echoing hulls don't creak from age. They warn. Every museum ship is a floating contradiction, a coffin that breathes, a monument that bleeds history into the present, a lie polished until it shines. Ask yourself, why preserve a weapon? Why spend millions keeping warships alive, submarines sealed tight, decks scrubbed like shrines? Why let children roam vessels built to kill? Because these ships are not dead. They are archived power, fossilized dominance, and hidden shame. They are whispering machines of empire, revolt, catastrophe, too dangerous to forget, too haunted to discard. You were never supposed to notice. But now you have. And once you're on board, there's no turning back. The tide's already rising. Can you hear it? They're not done with us yet. The wind howled through the rusting hulk of HMS Implacable on December 2nd, 1949, as chains groaned against her hull and the waves slapped like slow applause. The order had been signed. The oldest ship in the Royal Navy, second only to HMS Victory, was to be sunk, scuttled, destroyed by the very state that once called her a crown jewel. She was 150 years old. She had fought Napoleon. Now, she would die not by cannon fire, but by bureaucratic neglect. There were no salutes, no crowds, just a few men on a tugboat, watching as the black water swallowed history whole. Some wept, others looked away. The cables were cut, explosives set. The sea took her like a thief in broad daylight. What sank that day was not just oak and iron. It was memory, choked under cost-cutting and cold logic. It was a ghost murdered quietly, so the living wouldn't have to face what they'd chosen to forget. But she didn't go quietly. The newspapers printed a few paragraphs. Too expensive to maintain, they wrote. Not structurally sound. What they didn't say, what they couldn't say, was that something had cracked open in the national psyche. Something raw and unspoken. If ships could bleed, the waters around the Isle of Wight would have run red. The Royal Navy had just killed one of its own, and people felt it. In the marrow, like betrayal. This is where it begins. The first museum ship was not built. It was spared. HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, should have followed the Implacable. She was rotting, literally sinking in her own dry dock. By the 1830s, she was deemed unfit even for training cadets. The rot had spread through her spine. Timber creaked with every footstep. Birds nested in the rigging. The past was turning to dust while men passed by with clipboards, asking how much it would cost to forget her. But something held them back. Victory wasn't spared by logic. She was spared by myth. Nelson's death, the shot to the shoulder, the final whisper, "Thank God I have done my duty." These weren't just words. They were relics. And relics can't be scrapped. They haunt. They demand space in the present. And so she was braced, propped up, repainted like a corpse made ready for viewing. And suddenly, without permission or design, she became the first ship not to sail, but to stay. A monument made of war, glory, and unresolved memory. The year was 1922. Victory had become more than a ship. She was a museum before anyone called her that. But it wasn't just Britain. Far from it. Across the Atlantic, something darker was brewing. By the 1940s, the U.S. Navy had a problem. It had built too many ships. World War II had ended, and the docks were stuffed with floating steel giants that no longer had a war to fight. Aircraft carriers, submarines, Liberty ships by the hundreds. The temptation to scrap was overwhelming. Metal meant money. But something, some tug, some tremor, began to work against the machines of erasure. Veterans returned. They brought stories, photographs, medals wrapped in trembling hands. And they brought something else, something less visible but far heavier. Guilt, longing, grief. These weren't just vessels. They were memory machines. People had died here, come of age here, bled here. To melt them down felt obscene. So in 1948, the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, was restored again. Her frame had been rebuilt so many times she was more idea than original wood. But that didn't matter. Crowds came. Children touched the cannons. Old men stood in silence, fingers brushing the rails like it was skin. You could almost hear the past breathing. And that was the beginning of the fever. The fever to keep. But keeping came at a cost. Every saved ship was a battle. Between memory and money. Between silence and story. Between the past and the shallow, brittle present. Every argument was the same. Why waste funds on a dying relic? Why hold on to steel ghosts? Because nations are built on the stories they refuse to forget. Because when a ship dies, it doesn't just sink, it vanishes. In the 1950s, efforts began to save the German U-505, a captured submarine displayed in Chicago. At first, people came for the thrill. A Nazi sub. Right here. A trophy of war. But over time, something shifted. Children touched the periscopes. Families whispered inside the claustrophobic bunks. It stopped being a curiosity. It became a question. How did this exist? Why does it still feel alive? Because it was never just metal. Every pipe, every gauge, every rust-stained hatch carried fingerprints of a world once on fire. Maritime preservation didn't start with museums. It started with loss. The kind of loss that howls. The kind that refuses to rot quietly. The kind that claws its way up through time and demands to be seen. But not all ships made it. The SS United States, once the fastest liner in the world, now sits docked in Philadelphia, skeletal and fading. She waits, and waits, and waits. Tourists pass her by like an old woman muttering at the corner of a street. Her paint peels like memories slipping through fingertips. Her fate remains uncertain, held hostage by the same debate. Restore or erase? Ships don't scream. They creak. They resist, like bones refusing to decompose. In every nation that has touched salt water, there are ships that almost made it. The French Colbert, scrapped in 2007. The Japanese battleship Nagato, used as a nuclear target and vaporized at Bikini Atoll. Gone without trace. Gone without story. But some survive. They survive not because they are loved, but because they refuse to be forgotten. Because someone, somewhere, stood on a deck and felt the air change. Heard the silence. Knew that to scrap it would be sacrilege. Preservation isn't kindness. It's defiance. It's screaming NO into the mouth of time. Every museum ship today is a battlefield victory against forgetting. Anchored not in harbors, but in memory. Moored to history like bloodstains on a white uniform, refusing to wash off. And this is only the beginning. Because the ships still speak. The boy stopped at the edge of the gangway. 7 years old. Silence stitched across his face. Below him, the massive form of the USS Intrepid waited like a sleeping god. Its steel skin stretched tight over decades of heat, noise, death, triumph. The metal smelled of oil and ghosts. His hand clutched his father's tighter. He didn't know why his chest hurt, but something in him knew. This ship had seen things, felt things, screamed and bled in a way no classroom could ever teach. He stepped forward. The steel groaned beneath his shoes. Not loud, but just enough. Like the ship was waking. Watching. This wasn't a museum. It was a memory that refused to die. Every rivet in the Intrepid's frame still remembers the blast of kamikaze fire in 1944. The sky raining metal. Men running through corridors barely lit by flickering red bulbs, dragging the wounded, screaming names no one would ever answer. The heat of burning flesh echoing off the hangar deck. That sound, still clings to the walls if you stand still long enough. Not imagined, not fake, just there, waiting, like a whisper that hasn't found the right ears yet. The ship survived 4 direct hits. It kept floating, kept fighting, kept taking names of those who never left. And now, school children eat lunch above those same decks. How do you preserve that? You don't preserve a ship because it's pretty. You preserve it because it's real, brutal, ugly, honest. Steel doesn't lie. Wood doesn't flinch. A torpedo hull doesn't soften its edges to spare your comfort. You walk these decks, and the past holds you. It doesn't ask for permission. It grabs your throat and stares you down. This is why we don't let them rot. The British knew it when they hauled the SS Great Britain from the Falklands in 1970. She was abandoned, skeletal, a wreck filled with rust and barnacles and the sour stench of forgotten time. But as she rose from the water, people cried. Not because she was beautiful, but because she had endured. She had crossed oceans, carried emigrants, tasted ice and empire, and then been left. Like a used body. And someone, somewhere, couldn't take that. They brought her home, dragged her across the world, and placed her where she had first touched water, Bristol. No sails, no elegance. Just a massive iron shell holding the weight of human movement, desperation, hope, power. She'd carried stories across continents, and now she stood as a story herself. You can still walk her decks today, hear the creak, smell the salt, see your reflection in the glass, and for just a second, forget who you are. Ships are time machines that don't pretend to be magic. They're brutal, loud, greedy with space. But inside them, time folds. A locker becomes a coffin. A gun mount becomes a classroom. A bulkhead becomes a confession booth. When you step onto the Cutty Sark, your lungs tighten. Not from dust, but from scale. The space is narrow. The world feels smaller. Every inch designed for speed, for hunger, for the race between nations to control tea, opium, silk. You learn with your skin. Your shoulders knock against history. You feel the labor. You taste the blood that bought the luxury of a porcelain cup. No CGI can teach that. You need the wood, the rope, the iron, the peeling paint where a sailor once scratched a name now illegible. Not for display, not for drama, but because that mark happened. And if you sand it away, you erase more than letters. You erase a human pulse. That's why preservation is not about beauty. It's about truth. You walk through USS Pampanito, a World War II submarine now docked in San Francisco, and the air turns tight. You see the tiny bunks where 6 men shared 3 beds. The periscope that watched ships die. The mess hall where silence reigned because every sound could betray you to the enemy. This isn't staged. This isn't play. This is what it was. No textbook will make you duck your head to avoid smashing it against steel. But the Pampanito will. She'll make you crouch, stumble, feel small. Like the men inside once did, waiting to die in silence beneath the sea. A museum ship doesn't just preserve technology. It amplifies its meaning. The radar on the USS Texas isn't just a dish. It's the eye that watched the Normandy coast on June 6, 1944. That watched thousands pour into the mouth of war. You stand beneath it and realize that this machine, now still, once shook. Once turned with the breathless rhythm of invasion. You start to feel the fear, not of the machine, but of what it witnessed. This is why you keep the steel. Because once it's gone, the story collapses into silence. Into words that don't burn the same way the metal does. Ships are not passive objects. They are witnesses. They are classrooms, yes, but only if you're willing to be a student of pain, of complexity, of empire and extinction and sacrifice. These aren't places you go to learn about history. These are places where history looks back at you. You think you're studying the past, but the past is judging you. And sometimes, a ship becomes a screen. Think of the Queen Mary, docked at Long Beach. Her decks have seen both war and champagne. A troop carrier across the Atlantic. A luxury liner wrapped in fog and fame. And now, a film set. A haunted hotel. A backdrop for weddings and ghost tours. But underneath the lights, beneath the costumes, she still remembers. You can't fake the curve of a hull that's crossed enemy waters. You can't script the creak of real tension or edit the cold that settles in the engine room like a lingering breath. People say she's haunted. Maybe she is. But not by ghosts. By the weight of memory. By the knowledge that she once mattered. That steel, once, was sacred. Because what you walk through isn't a replica. It's the original stage. And every plank, every bolt, every echo is waiting for someone. Anyone. Who will listen close enough to hear the world that once screamed through these halls. Because the story is still moving. The silence was wrong. Boston Harbor, 5:23 a.m. A gray mist rolling low across the still water. No cannon fire. No shouts. No flags whipping in the wind. Just the breath of the sea, slow, deliberate, waiting. And then, out of the haze, she moved. The USS Constitution, wood groaning under her weight. 3 masts standing like monuments to something far older than pride. She wasn't being pulled. She was gliding. Alive. She hadn't moved under her own sail in over a century. Not since the world turned loud and fast. But on July 4th, 1997, on the edge of her 200th birthday, she sailed again. Not for war. Not for honor. For something heavier. Because ghosts don't rest easy in dry docks. She was launched on October 21st, 1797. Born from American anxiety, hammered together with southern pine, live oak, and the fury of a young republic determined to never be humiliated again. Her hull was thicker than expected, her cannons heavier. She was built not to intimidate, but to endure. The shipwrights didn't whisper dreams into her. They burned them in. And she learned fast. August 19, 1812. North Atlantic. War of 1812 raging. The Constitution squared off with the British frigate Guerriere. Clouds overhead. Sea rough. Salt stinging every open wound. The two ships closed. Muskets fired. Wood splintered. The British aimed straight for the Constitution's hull, and the shots bounced. Bounced. A sailor screamed, half laughing, half shaking. Her sides are made of iron. She earned her name that day, Old Ironsides. Not from engineers. Not from blueprints. From men who watched her defy death and cheered. She didn't just win that battle, she devoured it. The Guerriere was reduced to shattered timbers, blackened masts, and surrender. The Constitution didn't flinch. She stood in the smoke, sails torn, deck bloodied, and became a legend. She fought again, and again. January 1815, she faced two British ships, Cyane and Levant. She didn't break. She hunted. She tore through them in the darkness like a beast that had tasted war and wanted more. And then, time came for her. Steel replaced oak. Engines replaced sails. By the 1830s, whispers began. She's old. She's useless. She costs too much. There was talk of scrapping her. And that's when the letters started. Hundreds of them. From schoolchildren, veterans, poets, farmers, people who had never seen the sea but knew her name. People who understood that something more than wood and cannon lived inside her. One of those voices was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote in 1830, "Nail to the mast her holy flag, set every threadbare sail, and give her to the god of storms, the lightning and the gale." It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. Let her sail. Let her go down in glory. But do not humiliate her with forgetting. So they kept her. In 1927, they rebuilt her, piece by piece. $154,000 raised by schoolchildren, penny by penny, coins that still echo when you walk her decks. And when you do, when your foot touches that planked wood, you feel it. Not nostalgia, not pride, fury. She doesn't feel like a museum. She feels ready. As if the order came, she'd tear her mooring lines and sprint toward the open sea like it was 1812 again. Her guns are quiet now, but they haven't been silenced. They sleep. And inside her, inside every beam, every seam sealed with tar and salt, there's a thrum. A low beat, like a heart still pumping from wars long over. You stand on her deck and hear the flag snapping above. It's not a banner. It's a pulse. 13 stripes. 50 stars. Blood in every one. The Constitution isn't a reminder. She's a threat. A defiant roar echoing from a past that refuses to be boxed in by textbooks or plaques. Every tour guide smile is a mask. Beneath it, a ship that once killed to protect the fragile breath of a newborn nation. And she still belongs to the Navy. She has a crew, uniformed, sworn in, not actors, sailors. And every year, she fires live cannons into the sea, as if to say, "You've forgotten me, but I haven't forgotten what I am." They still polish her brass, swab her decks, raise her sails, not because she needs it, but because the tradition must be fed. National pride? It bleeds here. Not in parades, not in speeches, but in the quiet groan of wood that once carried the weight of a nation's fury and fear, and never broke. She is the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world. Not because of luck, but because something in her refuses to die. And the tourists, they don't know what they're standing on. They think it's a ship, a relic, but it's not. It's a warning, wrapped in oak, chained in honor, floating in silence, still watching, still waiting. And when the sun hits her hull just right, for a split second, she looks like she might move again. Not for show, not for peace, but because someone, somewhere, dared to forget what she once was. The shot that tore through Admiral Nelson's spine didn't make a sound loud enough to match its meaning. October 21st, 1805. The Battle of Trafalgar. Chaos. Smoke so thick it clung to the lungs like ash from a burning world. Men screamed, choked, and fell in heaps that no one had time to mourn. Cannons fired so close their flames touched. Blood ran down wooden stairs. The sea, black, red, then black again. And on the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, Horatio Nelson collapsed. He didn't cry out. He didn't flinch. He whispered one word, one name, again and again, Hardy. The bullet had shattered his shoulder, passed through his spine, and lodged in his chest. He knew. Everyone around him knew. But there was no time for grief. The fight raged on, and still the Victory stood her ground. That ship wasn't a vessel. She was an executioner, a cathedral, a god. Every plank of her had been soaked in sweat long before Trafalgar. She was built for war, rated first class, 3 decks, 104 guns, a floating weapon of national vengeance. Launched in 1765, long before Napoleon even had a name worth fearing. She had aged, yes, but the fire inside her hadn't dimmed. And at Trafalgar, she unleashed hell. She broke the Franco-Spanish line like a blade through cloth. Close quarters, boarding parties, a tempest of noise so loud, men forgot who they were. The Redoutable was ripped open by broadsides. The Bucentaur shattered, sails torn to shreds, blood on the rigging, the deck slick with it. And through it all, the Victory kept moving, not gliding, hunting. But her price was Nelson. He died below, in darkness, surrounded by men trying not to cry. His final words, "Thank God I have done my duty." Then silence. And the Victory, now soaked in smoke, splinters, and death, became a legend. Today, she stands docked at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. She doesn't move. She doesn't need to. The air around her knows. You step aboard and feel it in your stomach. The creak of the boards beneath your feet isn't just age. It's memory flexing its spine. The wood smells wrong. Not rotten. Not fresh. Just tense. Like it's waiting for something to begin again. Nelson's blood is still marked on the lower deck. They've painted a plaque over it, politely labeled. But you can feel it. That cold moment in the timber when the breath left his lungs. It hasn't gone. It never will. Tourists walk her decks like she's a museum. They don't realize she's still commissioned. Still part of the Royal Navy. She's not retired. She's sleeping. Tied down. Watched closely. Fed with preservation budgets and hushed reverence. But parts of her are not original. They've replaced planks, fitted supports, built scaffolding into her bones like a crutch for a dying god. Some whisper, she's no longer real. Too restored. Too curated. They say her soul was stripped in layers of varnish. But they're wrong. Because the soul of a ship doesn't live in the timber. It lives in the silence. In the moment you stand at her bow and know, absolutely know, that this thing once shattered empires. She shakes in high winds. Not from age. From anger. She wants to move again. The conservationists argue. Do we preserve her or perform her death? Is she a relic or a lie? Some want to let her rot. Let her fade like every other wooden warship lost to time. They say it's more honest. Others demand eternal preservation. A floating monument to a nation's greatest battle. To its greatest death. And still she waits. They replaced her keel. Bolted steel into her bones. Pumped humidity-controlled air into her hull. She's more suspended than docked. But that's not the controversy. The controversy is this. What happens when memory becomes maintenance? How long can you keep a warship alive before it stops being what it was? Victory isn't just a ship. She's a myth held together by screws and scaffolds. And yet, every year, the Royal Navy still pipes sailors aboard her. Still salutes. Still cleans her decks with reverence and ceremony. They say it's tradition. But it's more than that. It's fear. Fear that if they stop, even for a day, she'll vanish. Not in flame or water, but in forgetting. Her cannons are silent now, but loaded in another way. They fire questions. Hard ones. Bloody ones. What does it mean to win when your hero dies? What does it mean to preserve a ship that only lived to kill? What does it cost to remember when remembering hurts? Nelson's body lies elsewhere. But his shadow, it walks these decks. You feel it in the hold. In the claustrophobia of her gun decks, where men crouched beside 32-pounders, deafened, blinded, dying. Their screams weren't poetic. Their deaths weren't noble. They were necessary. That's what victory carried. Not glory. Sacrifice. She still carries it. You can smell the gunpowder in your lungs even though no one's fired a round in 2 centuries. You can hear the groan of rigging at midnight when the wind cuts through the dockyard just wrong. It sounds like mourning. or laughter, or both. And when you leave, when your foot touches land again, you don't feel relief. You feel something chasing you. Not guilt, not sadness, just a question, quiet, but sharp. Did you really understand what you just walked on? Because HMS Victory doesn't want your awe. She wants your silence. She wants your stillness. She wants your attention. Because beneath her paint, beneath the flags and plaques and smiling guides, there is still war in her bones. The pen trembled in the hands of Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu. 6 fingers gripped it, his leg lost in a previous war, the war before the one that ended this way. He looked down at the paper. Typed. Cold. Unforgiving. September 2nd, 1945. The deck of the USS Missouri. Tokyo Bay. The world held its breath. Rain had fallen earlier. Not enough to cleanse anything. Just enough to leave the teak deck slick. Just enough to feel like grief had soaked into the ship itself. A silence wrapped the Missouri. Not peace. Not yet. More like a suspension. Something hanging over them all. Too heavy to touch. Too sharp to ignore. The document was short. 13 articles. But every sentence carried millions of dead. American officers stood straight, motionless, their medals flashing against gray skies. General MacArthur's voice cut the air, flat, dry, rehearsed. And then the pen moved. That signature didn't make a sound, but it ended a world. In the exact place where hundreds had once loaded shells into 16-inch guns, where barrels had once ignited firestorms across Okinawa, men were now using ink to kill a war. The Missouri didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She held it. She holds it still. You can stand on that exact spot today. Steel, teak, brass plaques marking where each delegate stood. But the wind doesn't whistle here. It stings. You feel it in your throat. Because this isn't a memorial. It's a witness. Missouri was born in war and built for it. Launched January 29, 1944, at Brooklyn Navy Yard. Battleship. BB-63. 887 feet of American muscle. Armor thick enough to shrug off direct hits. Guns that could hurl 2,700-pound shells over 20 miles. She joined the war like she'd always been waiting for it. Fired on Iwo Jima. Rained destruction on Okinawa. Saw kamikazes scream through the sky and smash themselves into her side. May 11th, 1945. Fuel and fire and bone. A Japanese pilot died on her deck. The crew gave him a military burial at sea. Because even war has ghosts that demand respect. But then the war ended. And Missouri became something else. From 1945 to 1955, she stayed ready. A symbol. A threat. A message. In 1950, she fired again, this time in Korea. Shells thundered into Incheon, the smell of cordite clawing the air. But it was different now. Cold War years were colder than the word suggested. Missouri didn't just carry weapons. She was one. Her presence wasn't just muscle. It was strategy. A ship that said, "We're watching." A ship that said, "We're still capable of erasing cities." And yet, beneath the layers of deterrence and doctrine, she still remembered what she'd done. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. She hadn't dropped the bombs. She wasn't even there. But she'd held the end of that path. She'd been the platform for surrender, the altar of an empire's collapse. And some stains don't wash off. In 1955, they decommissioned her, stored her away, as if silence could tame something so loud. But ghosts don't stay buried. And ships like this don't rest. So they brought her back. In 1986, as Reagan rebuilt the Navy, Missouri was recommissioned. They added Tomahawk missiles, harpoons, CIWS. She was no longer just a battleship. She was a relic upgraded for Armageddon. And in 1991, she fired again. Operation Desert Storm. Precision-guided death. From the same deck where peace was once signed, Missouri launched weapons into a new generation of war. Then silence. Again. On March 31st, 1992, they decommissioned her for the last time. Not scrapped. Preserved. Because this wasn't a ship they could afford to forget. Not because of nostalgia. Because of weight. Because she had carried too many endings. And now she rests at Pearl Harbor. Not in the background. Not as a backdrop. She faces the USS Arizona. A ship sunk, entombed with her crew still inside. Missouri, the end of war, looks upon Arizona, the beginning. The symmetry is brutal and intentional. You stand on Missouri's deck and look across the water, and you don't need to speak. The air speaks for you. It tells you, This is where it started, and that is where it ended. And you are standing in the middle of something you don't deserve to forget. Tourists snap photos beside her massive guns. Some smile, some don't understand, because steel doesn't weep. But if you put your hand on her, just for a second, you'll feel it. Not warmth, not cold, just power, held in suspension. And underneath, below deck, her walls are lined with memories no paint can hide. Crew quarters frozen in time, metal bunks, personal lockers, worn linoleum. Control rooms packed with analog dials, red lit and humming. Shell handling rooms still reek faintly of grease and sweat. Missouri doesn't pretend to be alive. She refuses to admit she's dead. She lets you walk her passageways. But she's watching. And the closer you get to that surrendered deck, the quieter things become. Children whisper. Veterans stare. Some don't move for a long time. Because the surrender didn't feel like victory to everyone. It felt like weight. Like the future had been handed down by something unstoppable. And now here she is, floating off Ford Island. Moored to memory. Still. Immense. Awake. Her barrels point skyward. Not to threaten. To remind. That she once held the fate of nations on her back. And she's not done speaking. Not yet. The gun stopped. And for the first time in centuries, an Asian empire had shattered a European navy. May 27, 1905. Tsushima Strait. The sky cracked with smoke. Salt clung to every wound. Russian ships burned like funeral pyres on the water. And through the fire, through the chaos, one ship stood untouchable. Unshaken. Unforgiving. HMS Mikasa. Flagship of Admiral Togo Hayakairo. Silent. Watching. Dominant. Her hull was stained. Blackened from hours of relentless fire. Deck splintered. Her crew exhausted. Eyes bloodshot. Mouths dry from the thunder of their own guns. But the ship did not bend. She had just ended the myth of Western invincibility. 38 Russian vessels entered the Tsushima Strait. Only 3 made it home. And standing at the bridge, unmoving, was Togo. Uniform sharp. Eyes like steel blades. The man who whispered 6 words that would echo through history. The fate of the empire rests here. Mikasa carried that weight without blinking. She wasn't just a battleship. She was a signal flare to the world. Japan had risen. Constructed by Vickers in Britain and launched in 1900, Mikasa was cutting edge. 15,000 tons of armored muscle. For X-12-inch guns. 16 secondary 6-inch. She could crush cities from the sea. But her purpose was sharper. She wasn't built only to fight. She was built to announce. The Meiji Restoration had given birth to a new kind of Japan. Modern, iron-forged, hungry. Mikasa was its war cry. In Tsushima's aftermath, she became legend. Songs were written. Children memorized her name in classrooms like scripture. Her silhouette was printed on stamps, etched in stone, stitched into flags. She became more than a ship. She became myth. But myths are fragile. And fire doesn't care about memory. On September 11th, 1905, barely months after her greatest victory, Mikasa exploded in harbor. No enemy. No battle. Just an accident. A magazine detonation tore through her hull. 339 men died. Just like that. The pride of the Navy, burning in her own cradle. She sank where she lay, swallowed by her own silence. But Japan didn't bury her. They refused to. She was raised, repaired, and returned to service. She had to be. Because she wasn't a ship anymore. She was a symbol of the Meiji soul. In the decades that followed, Japan's hunger grew. And Mikasa stood as a constant. Quietly moored while newer ships surpassed her, while flags changed, while politics curdled into militarism. But she remained. In every parade, every naval ceremony, her image lingered like prophecy. By the 1930s, schoolboys were marched past her, taught to salute her hull as if it were alive. She became sacred. A war temple forged in British steel and baptized in Japanese fire. And then came 1945. The empire that had once celebrated her was gone. Hiroshima, vapor. Nagasaki, ash. Tokyo, rubble. The rising sun, lowered. American boots landed on Japanese soil. The Navy was disbanded. Warships were scrapped like rotten lumber. And Mikasa, the ship that once ended empires, now stood alone. Stripped. Vandalized. Her guns removed. Her decks used for dance halls. Her hull rusted, leaking. Children threw rocks at her sides. Drunks urinated below the bow where once admirals had stood. She was rotting, a ghost in her own harbor. Some wanted her gone. Too imperial, too militarist, too dangerous to remember. But memory doesn't ask for permission. In the 1950s, Japanese veterans, broken, disgraced, but still breathing, raised their voices. Do not let her die. They wrote letters. They raised funds. And, unexpectedly, General Douglas MacArthur, the American titan who had crushed the empire, intervened. He remembered Tsushima. He respected the ship. And so began her resurrection. By 1961, she stood restored. Stationary, muzzled, but present. In Yokosuka, she rests now, propped in concrete, locked in time. But step aboard, and something twists. You feel watched. The ship doesn't move, but she isn't dead. Her decks creak under your feet, like bones remembering how to march. Look down the barrels of her rebuilt guns. They don't feel ornamental. They feel hungry. Walk below. The air changes. Wood, iron, dust, and something else. Shame, pride, guilt. Mikasa is haunted, not by what she did, but by what she came to represent. The victory at Tsushima wasn't just military. It lit the fuse. From that moment, the Empire believed the impossible was possible, that Japan could conquer, that it should. And all of it, Manchuria, Nanking, Pearl Harbor, whispers from that first cannon blast in 1905. You don't just feel power on Mikasa. You feel responsibility. Every bolt screams it. Every plaque strains under it. The silence around her isn't peace. It's remorse made visible. And yet, she remains. Not because she's beautiful, not because she's loved, but because she matters. Because you cannot understand modern Japan, the wounds, the resilience, the rage, and the restraint, without standing where Togo stood and feeling the vibration of those guns through your spine. Because Mikasa didn't just end a war. She started something we're still trying to finish. The river was still. Cold wind whispered off the Neva. And then, a single flash of light. October 25th, 1917. A blank sky cracked open by the muzzle of the Aurora's forward gun. One shot. Not into flesh. Not into steel. But into history. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to signal. And it did. The Winter Palace fell. The provisional government collapsed. The Russian Empire shattered into dust. Lenin stepped forward. And the world caught fire. But the ship that fired that signal, didn't move. She floated. Silent. Unassuming. Watching a world fracture around her, as if she'd always known it would. The cruiser Aurora, born in 1900, had seen other battles. Tsushima, World War I. She'd taken shells before she became a symbol. But symbols carry more weight than gunfire. From the moment that shot echoed across Petrograd, she was no longer just a vessel. She became a relic of revolution, an artifact of ideology, a saint of the Soviet myth. They painted her story in textbooks. Children learned her name before they learned the alphabet. Her gray hull became sacred. She wasn't just preserved, she was worshipped. She appeared in parades, posters, films. Her image burned into the minds of millions like an oath. And still, she stayed moored near the Petrograd embankment, eternal, untouched, fixed like a knife in time. But time does not honor myths. It tests them. In the 1920s and 30s, she drifted from memory into symbol. But the steel never forgot. Inside her rusting corridors, the echo of revolution never left. Each bulkhead hummed with whispers, red flags, blood in the snow, the roar of hungry crowds. When World War II came, she was gutted, turned into a floating training barracks. Anchored, hollowed out. Air raids fell around her. But she survived again, always surviving, as if some force inside refused to let her sink. The Soviets didn't let her fade. They resurrected her. In 1957, she was restored, brushed clean, filled with glass displays and patriotic silence. She became a museum, a national shrine. But walk her decks, and something still aches. The boards groan beneath your feet like they want to speak. The cold along the gun barrels bites at your skin, as if the steel resents being caged behind velvet ropes. Her signal cannon, still in place. Still aimed, not at enemies, but at memory. At whatever version of truth the state needed that year. She became a tool again, not of revolution, but of control. Guides walked schoolchildren through her corridors like priests through a temple. This is where it began, they said. No doubt, no debate. But the ship never spoke. She watched as Lenin's corpse stiffened in its tomb. She watched as Stalin's shadow stretched across the land like winter. She watched as the myth grew teeth, and then as it began to rot. 1991. The Soviet Union shattered, just as the Tsar once had. And once again, Aurora stayed afloat. But now the red flags were gone. The parade stopped. The ideology that had raised her like an idol now lay dead in the snow. No more schoolchildren. No more certainty. She began to rust again. The plaques faded. The silence on board thickened, different now. Not sacred, just haunted. She should have been lost then. Scrapped. Like the dreams of the old regime. But she wasn't. Because something wouldn't let her go. Russia kept her. Not out of loyalty. Not out of pride. But because some memories can't be erased. They sink into iron. They stain wood. They live in the scent of old oil and freezing metal corridors. In 2014, she was restored again. A full overhaul. Stripped to her bones and rebuilt. And still, they returned her to the Neva. Anchored just as she was. Facing the same direction. Frozen in her revolutionary stance. Modern Russia doesn't speak of revolution like it once did. But they keep her. Because she's too dangerous to forget. Because standing on her deck, you don't just feel pride. You feel pressure. A weight that coils around your ribs. She has survived emperors. Survived commissars. Survived the silence of betrayal and the noise of forced remembrance. The Soviet plaques are still there. So is the gun. So is the moment. And if you listen closely, close enough to hear the metal breathing beneath the coats of paint, you'll feel that moment stretch out again. The wind. The quiet. The tension that coils just before the impossible becomes real. Then boom. And everything changes. The sky above the Hudson was quiet. But on the deck of the USS Intrepid, something waited. Steel. Cold. Massive. A ship stretched like a slab of war beneath the New York skyline. Unmoving, yet charged, like a sleeping beast forced into stillness. Her flight deck, lined with fighter jets. Her hangars echoing with static ghosts. But it was the silence that struck first. Not peaceful. Loaded. The kind of silence that clings to you. Like radio static before an emergency transmission. Like a countdown before a missile launch. She had once cut through Pacific waters at 32 knots, hunted submarines in the Atlantic, tracked Soviet movements by radar in the dead black of Cold War nights. But now she floats, not in combat, not in retreat, in suspension. Every screw in her frame remembers velocity. Every rivet aches with noise. And yet, today, schoolchildren walk her decks with ice cream in hand. Tourists lean against bulkheads once splattered with oil and adrenaline. They marvel at the State Route 71 Blackbird overhead, its sleek wings pulled taut like a blade. But the ship doesn't show everything. Not at once. Because this carrier is still armed, with memory. Launched in 1943, the USS Intrepid was built to kill. An Essex-class aircraft carrier born into the bloody roar of World War II. Her decks ran slick with sweat, aviation fuel, and fear. She was struck by 5 kamikazes. Survived a torpedo hit. Buried sailors in her belly. Still kept fighting. She fought again in Vietnam, her planes screaming across jungle skies. And later, during the Cold War, she transformed. An anti-submarine warfare carrier, hunting shadows in the ocean's dark lungs. Listening, waiting, tracking silence. Now, she's moored beside Pier 86. But she hasn't forgotten. You step into the hangar, and it swallows you whole. Aircraft wings hang above like predators. Steel teeth. War-painted sharks. Each plane with a name and number. Each one carrying invisible weight. Missions that never came home. Pilots who didn't eject in time. Targets that screamed before they disappeared. The lighting is dim, on purpose. So your mind fills the blanks. Stand beneath the A-12, the CIA's covert predecessor to the State Route 71, and your breath will slow. Because it feels like it could ignite and take off right then. Because its angles whisper of things you shouldn't know. Because it was built to fly faster than missiles. And then you walk into the space hangar. No transition. No explanation. Just a wall of stars and the sudden presence of Enterprise. The space shuttle that never touched orbit but still drags your soul towards something bigger. It's not nostalgia. It's confrontation. The kind that says, we tried to leave this planet. And we weren't ready. You stand inches from a machine built for the void. Black tiles singed. Fins cracked. The scent of metal is sharper here. More surgical. like someone's about to peel open the skin of the universe. And above all of this, the carrier holds it together. Intrepid isn't just a platform. She's a curator of power. She didn't volunteer for this. She didn't ask to carry the Cold War, the space race, and the age of supersonic flight like a relic on her back. But she does, because she has space inside her. Room for every contradiction. War and wonder. Destruction and awe. Flight and falling. Her metal has heard the voice of astronauts and the screams of the wounded. She's launched warplanes and harbored peace ceremonies. She once sailed in formation with warships. Now she shares a skyline with tourists. And still, beneath the multimedia screens, the VR headsets, the child-friendly panels, she waits. Waits for someone to see her. Not the exhibits. Not the planes. Her. The hangar deck still echoes in odd ways. You step just right, and you'll hear the boots of men who died young. Their voices don't scream. They whisper. Here. Right here. This is where we launched into hell. It's not written on the plaques. You feel it in the vibration of your bones. You climb the narrow stairs, up to the bridge. Each step feels like a trespass, because you're walking through command, through history, through places where decisions were made that ended lives. You reach the captain's chair. The view is a panorama of New York's shimmering skyline. But look down, and you'll see the catapults, the aircraft elevator, the places where machines of death once rose from belly to sky. The whole ship hums with contradiction. Outside, she's a family attraction. Inside, she's a haunted cathedral of velocity. And the farther you go into her heart, the more that contradiction tightens. There are voices in the walls. Not ghosts. Recordings. Narration that loops. But if you stop, if you really stop, you'll hear something different. The hum behind the speaker. The pause between words. The part that isn't scripted. That's where the story lives. You exit into sunlight again, blinking. Tourists crowd around a MiG. Children press buttons. Everything seems safe. But your skin doesn't feel safe. You touched a ship that once held the balance of war in her decks. You walked across steel that once absorbed fire. You breathed air recycled through decades of tension and precision. And now you're outside. But part of you isn't. Part of you is still inside her, beneath the lights, under the jets, staring into the shuttle's windows, asking questions you didn't know you carried. And that part of you will never leave. Under the museum lights, the steel looks silent. But step inside, and the air shifts. Tight, stale, charged with something ancient and unfinished. You are inside a submarine. The door seals behind you with a hiss that sounds too final. And suddenly, you're in the belly of war. The walls are too close. The ceiling, too low. The floor, too narrow. Every step feels like trespass. Every breath tastes like old metal and ghosts. In Chicago, it waits. The U-505, a captured German submarine pulled from the Atlantic in 1944. She's not fiction, not replica. She's real. And she hates being still. You can hear it in the pipes that stretch like veins. In the bunks that hang over torpedoes like afterthoughts. In the control room, where dials and gauges still blink at nothing. Touch the wheel, and you're holding the same metal gripped by men who once thought they'd never be found. But they were, dragged from the sea like a secret that refused to stay buried. She rests now indoors, lights above her, tourists beside her. But she remembers pressure, depth, silence so thick it suffocated. Her captors didn't sink her. They couldn't. She was too important. They kept her. For study. For message. For memory. And now she waits. A trophy. A coffin. A warning. But you, 505 isn't alone. In Groton, Connecticut, beneath a gray sky and the scent of salt, sits another beast, the USS Nautilus. This one broke the rules. She didn't sail like others. She didn't breathe air. She was the first nuclear submarine, launched in 1954, and she moved beneath the world, not through it. Under the ice of the North Pole, she passed, silent, unseen, untouchable. Now, visitors walk her narrow spine, each room tighter than the last. The reactor compartment sealed, off limits, but still there, humming like a heart with no beat. Every surface is function. Every lever, calculated trust. Walk her halls, and your chest tightens. Not from fear, yet, but from the sense that this ship was not meant to be touched by daylight. She was built for darkness, for pressure, for silence that could shatter a mind. Inside these subs, time folds. You see coffee mugs still in racks, clipboards with typewritten orders, Journals etched with shaking hands and the weight of responsibility no surface dweller will ever understand. Submariners volunteer to vanish. They trade sky for steel, space for proximity, comfort for control. They sleep beside weapons, eat in engine rooms, exist in metal veins below the world. And now their world is on display. But no museum lighting can erase what happened inside. Every visitor feels it. That moment, just a few feet in, when the novelty drops and the dread rises. Because it's not just tight, it's closing. You feel it in your ribs, in your lungs, in your thoughts, which start to race without moving. And still you walk, because something inside pulls you forward. There's a torpedo room, polished, labeled, but it smells like oil and finality. A crewman slept here once, above explosives, knowing every second of sleep was borrowed. The bunk is still made, as if he just stepped away. But you know better. No one sleeps peacefully down here. Not really. Every system on board was built for one purpose: to hunt or not be hunted. Every valve knows urgency. Every wire remembers noise. Claustrophobia isn't the cost of life underwater. It's the design. They built these ships to be small, invisible, intimate. Intimate like breathing someone else's exhale for months. Intimate like shaving with 10 men watching. Like knowing that if the hull fails, your body will compress to death before your brain even registers the pain. And the museums, those brilliant, curated cathedrals of memory, they don't sanitize that. They preserve it. Some try to soften the edges. Touchscreens, sound effects, narration playing through ceiling speakers, telling you how it worked. But the real story isn't in the narration. It's in the gaps, the pauses, the places where the audio goes quiet, and all you can hear is your own breath echoing off steel. The smell of rust that won't go away. The sudden thought that you're below the surface, even when you're not. Because submarines don't need water to pull you under. Even as exhibits, they remain machines of tension. Not war machines anymore. But they remember, and so do their walls. You step out again, back into air, back into sunlight, and your lungs pull hard. Not because you ran, because you forgot how free breathing feels. But part of you stays inside, back there, between the bulkheads, in the darkness, in the silence, waiting for the pressure to return. Because submarines aren't just displayed. They inhabit, they wait, below your thoughts, in the quiet parts of your fear. And even above ground, they're still beneath you. Cold metal groans under a gray, heavy sky. The Russian submarine B-39, a shadow of the Cold War, lies moored in an American port, its hull scarred, silent, and defiant. The bitter wind cuts through the narrow hatches and vents, as if trying to peel away decades of secrets trapped inside. This is no relic of distant history. It is a living monument to tension that once nearly snapped the world in half. Step aboard, and the atmosphere suffocates you. The corridors are claustrophobic, dimly lit, lined with pipes that coil like veins, pulsing with forgotten Cold War dread. Every surface bears the weight of whispered orders, of midnight patrols beneath the ice, of unseen eyes watching the enemy. The steel hull remembers sonar pings, nuclear patrols, and the constant breath hold beneath the unforgiving sea. This is the B-39, a Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine launched in 1967, once prowling the Pacific Ocean in silent pursuit of supremacy. She is both a ghost and a trophy, hauled from Soviet waters into foreign hands, her story forced into a new frame. The irony is sharp and raw. An enemy's war machine preserved in the heart of America, on display to curious tourists and veterans alike, a bitter symbol stitched into the fabric of uneasy peace. The air inside carries an unspoken tension. A submarine built to kill now hosts laughter and footsteps, light, disconnected from the heavy breath of war that once filled these narrow halls. Visitors run their fingers along cold consoles, peering into cramped cabins once occupied by men who lived with the constant pulse of danger. The clash between everyday curiosity and the harsh reality of the Cold War warship is a silent, electric charge that hums beneath the surface. Interpretation of this vessel is a tightrope walk. Can you speak of enemy valor without betraying your own? Can the steel walls convey the brutal logic of the Soviet Navy without slipping into propaganda? Every plaque and exhibit tries to thread the needle, delivering facts with careful neutrality, But beneath the measured words lies a turbulent sea of conflicting memories. This is history tangled in barbed wire, colored by politics and the passage of time. The B-39 does not offer easy answers. It challenges visitors to confront the shadowy decades when two superpowers stood on the edge of apocalypse, their weapons poised and ready. Its cold, unforgiving steel asks who the enemy really was, and if, perhaps, both sides were prisoners of the same invisible war. Around the B-39, other Soviet-era vessels lie silent in foreign harbors, each a paradox. They are trophies and warnings, monuments to a chapter where the world balanced on the edge of a knife. Each hatch, each worn control panel, each narrow bunk carries the ghost of a sailor's heartbeat, steady, anxious, alive beneath the weight of the Cold War. But here, in this foreign port, they become something else, objects of fascination and discomfort, sites where history resists simplification. Political neutrality struggles to hold against the tide of human stories etched in rust and rivets. The past looms large, complex, unyielding, and alive. The B-39 waits beneath the somber sky, a titan caught between worlds, forever holding its breath beneath the waves that once were its battlefield. The silence inside the Queen Mary doesn't feel normal. It presses against your skin. Thick, heavy, listening. You stand in the first-class pool room. Empty, cold, locked to the public. And for a moment, you think you hear footsteps. But no one walks. No one breathes. The tiled floor reflects nothing. The air smells like time rotting in velvet. This ship doesn't rest. She waits. The RMS Queen Mary was born to move. Launched in 1934, dressed in the sharp lines of Art Deco elegance, she cut through the Atlantic like a silver blade. She carried dukes, spies, movie stars, and monarchs across a world collapsing into war and clawing back out again. Her halls once echoed with champagne laughter. Now, at night, they echo with something else. On her maiden voyage, she was untouchable, sleek, fast, the future bottled in steam and polish. But war came. In 1939, the glamour peeled off. Her decks were stripped. The black and red Cunard livery vanished under thick navy gray. Her ballroom became barracks. Her chandeliers went dark. The Queen turned soldier. They called her the Gray Ghost. Faster than any U-boat, invisible in fog, carrying thousands of Allied troops in her stomach. She ran from Scotland to Sydney, from New York to the edge of hell. In 1942, she collided with HMS Curacao off the Irish coast. Cut it in half. Over 300 men died in less than a minute. She was under strict orders not to stop. She didn't. She couldn't. The sea swallowed them whole while she pushed forward, fast and silent. Her speed kept her alive. Her silence haunts her now. You walk her hallways in 2025 and the past does not feel gone. It feels crushed into the walls. The carpets muffle nothing. The elevators creak like breath. The rooms are dressed in gold and crimson, but their mirrors reflect things that don't stand there. Tourists come for the ghost stories, the thrill, the whispers of trapped souls in cabin B340. But they don't understand the weight this ship carries in her iron bones. This is not a haunted house. It is a haunted life. After the war, the Queen tried to return to glamour. She wore her old colors again. She sailed with pride again. But the magic had shifted. The world had moved on. Jets stole her thunder. The skies replaced the seas. By 1967, the Queen Mary was no longer a queen. She retired in Long Beach, California, cut from the water, chained to a pier, her engines silenced forever. She became a hotel, a museum, a tourist trap, a relic. But ships built to move hate standing still. And she makes you feel it. Inside the dining rooms, you still smell cigars that haven't burned in 50 years. The silverware is polished, yet untouched. The parquet floors creak even when you're still. In the officers' quarters, the brass nameplates remain, though the men who bore them are dust. And the pool room, always the pool room. No one can explain why it's sealed. No one agrees on what happened there. But the chill doesn't fade. People say the lights flicker when no one is inside. That the water stains never dry. That something breathes, just under the tiles, waiting for the door to open again. The Queen Mary has become a collage of identities. A floating palace. A floating barracks. A floating prison of memory. She bears the burden of all who walked her decks, carved into her staircases, burned into her steam stacks, echoing in her massive hull. Preservation is war now. Her woodwork warps. Her decks crack. Her rust spreads. Every effort to save her feels too slow. Funding comes and dries up. Plans are made, then buried. Some want to restore her. Some want to let her die. But she refuses. She stands alone in the harbor, out of time. Her funnels still tower. Her name still gleams in faded letters. But something inside her still fights, against rot, against erasure, against the cheapness of memory turned into merchandise. They rent her rooms. They sell her history. But she remembers the blood. She remembers wartime screams trapped in the steel. She remembers refugees and generals and nurses and the smell of burning oil in the engine rooms during blackouts. She remembers the men she did not stop for. And maybe that's why she speaks. Not through words, but through pressure. The Queen Mary does not need permission to haunt. She haunts because the truth is not at peace. Because history cannot be buried under luxury linens and LED lights. She stands not as a novelty, but as a reckoning. A ship that lived through the glamour and the horror, through victory and guilt. And now, she watches. Even docked, she sails, through memory, through myth, through rumor. And still, she waits. Under a black sky in the Falkland Islands, the wind tore through rust and rot like it had a score to settle. In a half-sunken cradle of mud, shrouded in silence and fog, the SS Great Britain waited. The water sloshed against her iron bones. Not waves of travel, but decay. Time had chewed through her decks. Her ribs, exposed and weeping rust, groaned softly when the wind shifted, like the ghost of a breath long ago exhaled. She should have been dead. Launched in 1843, she had once defied everything. An iron hull, a screw propeller, steam engines. Madness, they said. A floating experiment. A thing that should have failed. And yet, she roared across the Atlantic, faster than wind, stronger than oak, dragging the 19th century into the machine age whether it was ready or not. Brunel carved her from ambition. She was not just a ship. She was a threat to limits. But history is cruel. Innovation rusts. Glory starves. And the sea always takes back what it lends. By 1937, she had crawled to the ends of the earth. No longer proud. No longer fast. Just floating refuse. Stripped. Forgotten. Beached in the Falklands as a coal hulk. Left to collapse into herself. Yet she didn't. Even then, broken and sinking, she held her form. Her spine remained straight. Her iron refused to bow. And in 1970, something impossible happened. The world remembered. The salvage was madness. Too expensive, too risky, too late. But still they came. Engineers. Historians. Dreamers with rust under their fingernails. They cut away the seaweed. They patched the holes. They wrapped her in cables and metal faith. Then they floated her, barely, onto a barge. 8,000 miles. That's how far they towed her. Through storms, past doubters, across time itself. The Atlantic shuddered as it carried its former queen home. People stood silent when she arrived in Bristol, where Brunel had once walked her decks in boots stained with soot and hope. The city hadn't seen her in 127 years. Now she was back. A corpse. But not cold. The restoration didn't hide her wounds. It preserved them. She wasn't repainted into a lie. They left her scars raw, her history visible. Experimental techniques sealed her in a glass cradle, dry air pumped below her to stop the rot. The illusion of water around her hull fools the eye, but the truth lies beneath, a preserved wound frozen in time. Step aboard today, and the silence is deceptive. It breathes. You feel her tension in the floors. You hear her whisper through the iron. Every bolt, every rivet, hums with the ghosts of engineers who defied God and would to build something the world had never seen. The past doesn't sleep here. It presses against your ribs. The air below deck feels thick, not with dust, but with pressure. Victorian immigrants to Australia once cried in these bunks, their bodies curled against a future they couldn't see. Steam hissed through pipes that no human had ever trusted before. Fire drove the ship, and it still does. The dining hall gleams, reconstructed with maddening accuracy. But listen closely, and you'll hear more than the clink of recreated silverware. You'll hear the groan of metal that carried the weight of empires. The stokehold, recreated in grime and sweat, reminds you that this ship was not elegant. She was violent. Fire in her lungs, coal in her throat. She burned her way forward. But the preservation is never still. The museum is alive, engineered like the ship herself, pushing the limits of conservation. Layers of innovation built on top of layers of rust. She is watched constantly. Humidity sensors, pressure monitors, corrosion maps. She is studied like a patient too rare to lose. And still, there are things they can't fix. The creaks that come when no one moves. The cold pocket in the bow that refuses to rise above freezing. The way some visitors swear they hear hammering in the walls, though no restorers are inside. These are the things not printed on pamphlets. These are the things the iron remembers. She does not let go of her past. And maybe that's the price of survival. She was born to be impossible, and now she floats in defiance of death. Not as a replica, not as a reimagining, but as herself, damaged, resurrected, breathing history through steel lungs. You stand on her deck and you feel it. The shiver that runs down your spine isn't wind. It's weight, the gravity of invention, of a world changed by iron and fire. Every footstep echoes into 1843. Every breath carries coal and salt. The SS Great Britain did not sink. She waits, unburied, unforgiven, and unforgotten. The air hung thick with salt and silence, as if the very sea held its breath. Along the dock in Rotterdam, the colossal silhouette of the SS Rotterdam loomed, steel giant turned silent witness. The dusk-smeared shadows across her decks, painting her not as a ship, but as a leviathan guarding memories no one dared fully confront. Her smokestacks stood like ancient sentinels, echoing the clangs of machinery that once roared beneath them, now replaced by whispers of lives carried across oceans, stretching from the wounds of war into the fragile hope of new beginnings. Launched in 1959, the SS Rotterdam wasn't just any ship. She was the crown jewel of post-war Dutch maritime pride, a symbol clawing its way out of the rubble. The world was trembling with aftershocks, nations scrambling to stitch themselves together. Amid this, she sliced through the waves, a beacon for thousands of souls fleeing the echoes of conflict, boarding her with trembling hands and heavy hearts. For many, she was the vessel of fate, ferrying immigrants from the Netherlands to distant shores, their futures knotted with uncertainty, hope, and fear. The polished brass rails, now gleaming under artificial lights, once felt the grip of trembling hands clutching at farewells. Families separated by history's cruel scissors found their stories folded into her cabins, etched into her very bulkheads. The laughter of children echoed alongside whispered prayers for a better life, a life rewritten beyond the shadows of empire and war. Every creak in her hull was a heartbeat, one that matched the thundering pulse of dreams and despair locked in the human cargo she bore. But beneath the grandeur lay a fissure, a tension between the Netherlands' shimmering maritime legacy and the darker tides of its colonial past. The ship sailed not just over water, but over waves of collective memory, where pride tangled with the ghosts of empire. Her decks bore witness to a nation wrestling with identity, grappling with what it meant to be Dutch after the fall of colonies that had once fueled the empire's rise. The Rotterdam carried immigrants, yes, but also carried the weight of displacement, of histories uprooted and replanted in foreign soil. The stories of those who sailed her fold into the wider narrative of post-colonial reckoning, echoing the fractured voices of a nation learning to face itself. Now, docked as a heritage hotel, the SS Rotterdam wears her transformation like armor. The grand staircases, once polished for travelers hungry for the glamour of the sea, now creak beneath the footsteps of tourists drawn by nostalgia, by the allure of history frozen in steel. The cabins, luxury suites and humble quarters alike, hold the breath of decades, the invisible residue of laughter, sorrow, and countless whispered secrets. It's a stage where memory and commerce collide, where the past is packaged and sold, and the ghostly hum of engines long silenced rises anew in the chatter of visitors seeking connection to something they can never quite grasp. The smell of varnished wood and salt air mingles with the hum of elevators and the clatter of plates from the dining rooms turned restaurants. Yet, beneath this veneer lies an unspoken tension. The ship's legacy isn't neat. It's messy, fraught with contradictions. Her decks recall joyous farewells and desperate escapes, triumphs and traumas tangled in every knot of rope, every glint of porthole glass. She is both a shrine and a relic, an ironclad paradox where Dutch maritime nostalgia crashes into the waves of unresolved history. Tourists stroll her promenades under neon glow, snapping photos, unaware that beneath their feet lie stories that refuse to stay silent. The ship becomes a theater of remembrance and forgetting. Her hull holds the echoes of laughter and tears, of sailors and immigrants, of empire's collapse and the fragile birth of new identities. Each cabin, each corridor, breathes with the ghosts of those who passed through, some seeking fortune, others fleeing pasts too heavy to carry. Yet the ship remains stubbornly alive, a monument not just to voyages across oceans, but voyages within the Dutch psyche. She reminds a nation that the sea is more than waves and salt. It is memory, identity, and sometimes the sharp sting of what was left behind. And as the night deepens, the SS Rotterdam waits, not just as steel and wood, but as a living vessel of stories, rocking gently against the shore, whispering truths that refuse to fade, sailing endlessly through the restless tides of history. The air trembles with the thunderous heartbeat of a ship's engine, pistons pumping, boilers roaring beneath steel plates that have borne the weight of a world at war. The Jeremiah O'Brien stands colossal, a massive leviathan forged not in aristocratic splendor but in the frantic pulse of industrial necessity. The year is 1943. America's shipyards churn endlessly, hammer striking steel, welders shaping destiny with every spark. Here lies the embodiment of urgency. A Liberty ship born from the fires of mass production, a ship not of luxury or leisure, but of relentless purpose and survival. Steel ribs creak and groan as she slices through the ocean, carrying the hopes, fears, and sweat of thousands. She is the backbone of supply lines stretched thin, the iron artery pumping lifeblood to distant battlefields. Every rivet hammered in her hull echoes the tension of a world holding its breath. Cargo holds stuffed with tanks, ammunition, food, mundane yet vital, form the silent payload that sustains armies, breaks sieges, and shifts the tide of war. Her decks bear the footprints of men who battled storms and enemy fire alike, their nerves taut as the cables that brace her mast. The sound of distant gunfire, the salty sting of the sea spray, the crackle of radio static, these are the textures of her existence. Yet, this was no grand warship gleaming with polish. She was the workhorse, the indispensable everyman of the fleet. Built in a mere 56 days by the Kaiser shipyards, she defied the traditional timeline of shipbuilding, a symbol of industrial might wielded like a weapon. Her name, Jeremiah O'Brien, borrowed from a Revolutionary War hero, was a quiet shout of defiance and resilience. She was one of nearly 2,700 Liberty ships, each a rolling testament to American wartime production's frantic tempo. Time pulses forward to 1994. The Jeremiah O'Brien, a survivor among thousands scuttled or scrapped, stands ready to relive history. The Normandy coast beckons, a watery graveyard turned battlefield turned sacred memory. With engines echoing like thunderclaps across the channel, she sails once more toward the beaches where thousands fell, where freedom was wrested from tyranny in the blood and mud of D-Day. The media frenzy is electric. Every camera lens hungry for a glimpse of living history. Here is not a relic locked behind glass, but a breathing, moving vessel, her steel skin weathered yet unyielding. On board, every deck creaks with stories. The engine room, cavernous and claustrophobic, pulses with the primal rhythm of boilers and pistons. Visitors feel the heat seep through the steel walls, the groan of machinery like the distant roar of war itself. It is a visceral reminder of the raw, grueling labor that kept her alive. Men stoked the fires, wrestled with steam and oil, battled exhaustion in cramped quarters. The hum of the engines is a ghostly echo of those lives, those sacrifices. Each control valve, each gauge, is a silent witness to the high-stakes gamble of war. Her decks are worn but alive, footsteps tracing the paths of sailors who once manned her guns, navigated her course through enemy waters, and lived with the constant threat of torpedoes and bombs. The cold steel underfoot contrasts with the heat of memories carried in the air. The smell of salt and oil, of sweat and metal, saturates the space. She teaches not through placards or sterile displays, but by thrusting visitors into the very environment where courage was forged in the claustrophobic press of wartime service. The ship embodies the paradox of industrial war, the cold geometry of mass production fused with the brutal intimacy of human endurance. The roar of engines and the clang of cargo doors are counterpoints to whispered prayers and shouted orders. The Jeremiah O'Brien is not a monument carved from marble, but an iron giant etched with the raw scars of conflict and survival. Her decks still hum with the restless spirit of those who sailed her, the tension of lives lived on the razor's edge of destruction. She reminds us that victory was as much about factories and assembly lines as about battlefields and generals. The roar of her engine is a rallying cry to a nation that transformed steel into salvation. Her survival against time's relentless tide defies the fate of many others, scrapped, sunk, forgotten. The ship is a defiant heartbeat, a tangible connection to the relentless tempo of a world at war, an echo of the countless unseen hands that shaped history in sweat-drenched shipyards and storm-lashed decks. As the Jeremiah O'Brien creaks and sighs beneath the sky, she waits, anchored in history yet restless, an iron sentinel reminding all who board her that the roar of engines and the cry of freedom are forever intertwined. The ship's story is not a closed chapter but a living, breathing testament, pulsing with every turn of her propeller, every hiss of her steam, carrying the weight of history forward through the restless waves. Under a sky of burnt copper and smoke-choked air, the flames clawed upward like a starving animal. It was May 21st, 2007. The Cutty Sark, one of the last survivors of the age of wind and empire, was on fire. Wood cracked like bones. Iron frames groaned. The proud ship that had once raced across oceans, teeth bared for profit and glory, was now a silhouette wrapped in orange fury. Fire crews swarmed her like ants, but it was too late for silence. Something old, something heavy with memory, was being devoured. Long before this inferno, she had sliced through the South China Sea, her sails straining with wind like a war horse stretching into the gallop. Built in 1869, every inch of her was ambition, lean, elegant, viciously fast. A tea-clipper, yes, but more than that. A tool of empire, a predator dressed in polished oak and polished brass. She didn't simply transport leaves. She carried the urgency of markets, the pressure of colonial balance sheets, the soft cruelty of luxury, carved from someone else's hunger. Her hull once glistened in the moonlight off Canton, where crates were stacked by coolie labor, bodies bent in sweat, unseen by the tea drinkers of London's drawing rooms. She was loaded not by machines, but by men, exploited, voiceless, forgettable, whose blood mixed with the dust of dockyards. The Cutty Sark's speed was not innocent. She raced for fortune in a world that did not believe in fairness. When tea lost its urgency, she turned to wool, then opium. It's whispered through the archives, hidden in manifests, obscured in the polite language of trade. But she ran the routes that greased empire. She was an artery of empire, pumping wealth extracted through silk and sin. Her name comes from a witch in Scottish folklore, a wild figure clinging to a horse's tail. And there's a strange accuracy in that. The Cutty Sark always clung to something just beyond reach: speed, profit, relevance. Even in her golden years, she was haunted by decline. Steamships were coming. The wind would no longer matter. But still she sailed, defiant, proud, her crew hauling canvas and swearing at storms, her hull creaking with exhaustion. She passed through too many hands, too many ports, too many storms. And still she survived. War came and went. Flags changed. Maps shifted. The ship endured. When she was brought to Greenwich in 1954, suspended between iron and memory, it wasn't nostalgia. It was defiance. She wasn't allowed to rot, like the others. She was made to stand. An imperial relic turned museum, transformed but not silenced. But preservation has always been a strange dance. What do you keep? What do you erase? Do you show the grime of empire or polish the brass of maritime pride? Do you name the workers from India, China, the Malay ports, who made her cargo possible? Or Or do you only talk about speed records, famous captains, restoration funds? They rebuilt her from the bones. Interactive displays flicker under her copper hull now. Children press buttons and hear ocean sounds. Families marvel at the narrow bunks, the wheel, the carvings on the bow. The ship is alive again, but differently. Her sails don't catch wind anymore. They catch memory. And not all memory is soft. Stand beneath her, in the dry dock, and there's a pressure in your chest. Her iron frame curves above like a leviathan, frozen mid-motion. You feel small. You feel watched. History stares back, not politely, not passively, but with a sharpness that makes your throat tighten. She asks what you remember and what you choose to forget. They've restored her deck with care. The wood gleams. The lines are coiled neatly, like sleeping serpents. But not everything has been scrubbed clean. There are hints, phrases in the panels, questions in the air. Colonialism, trade, labor, violence. These aren't ghosts you can banish with paint. They live in the spaces between the planks, in the empty captain's cabin, in the silent hold where cargo once groaned with the weight of the world. There's something disorienting about standing aboard her now. In the safety of a modern world, she helped shape through speed and exploitation. You feel the ghost of wind in your ears, the creak of timber underfoot, the smell, manufactured, faint, but there, of tar, salt, rope. But also, beneath it, something harder to name. A kind of unspoken question hanging in the air. Was it worth it? For empire? For tea? For speed? The Cutty Sark survived fire, abandonment, and time. But she does not offer comfort. She is a blade, still sharp. A memory you cannot quite look away from. A whisper of sails in the dark, asking not to be celebrated, but understood. And somewhere, between the hiss of the fire in 2007 and the soft sound of children's footsteps in her museum corridors, she still sails, through conscience, through history, through the burning need to remember exactly what made her fast. The sun was low and hot, beating down on the decks of El Galleon as it creaked against the restless waves. Wooden planks moaned underfoot, ropes hissed with tension, and the scent of salt and tar clung thick in the air. Every step echoed like a drumbeat, a reminder that this was not just a ship, but a resurrection, an echo of an empire carved in wind and steel. Here, centuries of power, greed, and ambition were reborn, one nail, one beam, one canvas sail at a time. El Galleon is a ghost made flesh, a meticulously reconstructed Spanish galleon that sails through modern waters, carrying a cargo heavier than silver or gold. The stories of an empire that stretched across oceans and centuries. But beneath the polished wood and fluttering flags lies a fragile tension, a clash between history and spectacle that refuses to be silent. The original galleons, those towering giants of the 16th and 17th centuries, were vessels of conquest and commerce, carrying the spoils of the New World back to Spain. Their hulls held treasures that reshaped economies and destinies, but also the dark weight of colonial violence. Each cannonball fired, each sail hoisted, whispered the rise of a maritime titan, but also the suffering left in its wake. The very design of these ships, high forecastles, reinforced hulls, multiple decks, spoke of wariness, of the ever-present threat from pirates, rival fleets, and the unknown. Recreating El Galleon today is an act of both devotion and defiance. Builders shape every timber with care, their hands tracing the lines drawn by centuries-old plans. The rigging is threaded with ropes heavier than a man's arm, and the sails billow with a stubborn breath that refuses to forget. But this is no mere museum piece. It lives and moves, a floating classroom and theater, inviting eyes wide with wonder to step aboard. Yet beneath the grandeur lies a gnawing question. How much of this is history, and how much is theater? The challenge is immense, balancing the brutal realities of 16th century life with the desire to enchant and educate. The swaying decks conceal cramped quarters where sailors once lived in darkness and fear, swallowed by salt spray and exhaustion. The guns, though reinstalled, are no longer fired in anger but roar in staged battles that thrill crowds. The ship invites awe, but also risks glossing over the violence and exploitation that defined its era. Every plank in El Galleon seems to murmur of this struggle between fact and fantasy. The wooden beams gleam with fresh varnish, yet beneath them lies the imprint of human toil, builders' sweat, sailors' hardship, indigenous lives uprooted. The ship carries the legacy of Spain's maritime empire, a network that spanned from Europe to the Americas and Asia, linking continents with threads of power, culture, and conflict. The galleon's silhouette against the horizon is a reminder of a world forever altered, of empires built on oceans and blood. Visitors step aboard and feel the weight, not just of wood and iron, but of history itself. The narrow staircases, the low ceilings, the creaking hull, they whisper of sailors packed like cargo, of the endless days and nights battling storms and uncertainty. The ship breathes a story of survival and ambition, but also of displacement and destruction. Each shadow cast by the rigging is a reminder of the lives entwined with the ship's fate. The crew and guides carry this weight too. They are storytellers in an ongoing play, balancing pride in their craftsmanship with a growing awareness of the need for honesty. They recount tales of battles and voyages, but also speak of the ship's role in an empire whose legacy is complicated, full of contradictions and scars. The galleon is both a symbol of national pride and a vessel that carries the memories of those who suffered in its wake. As El Galleon sails from port to port, it becomes a moving stage for reflection and debate. Its majestic form commands attention, but beneath that all lies unease. How do you honor the past without glorifying conquest? How do you celebrate maritime skill without ignoring the cost? The ship forces confrontation, not with grand conclusions, but with the raw, unsettled questions that refuse to settle. Its presence in modern harbors is a paradox, an invitation to remember and to reckon. The reconstructed sails flutter like flags calling out to the past, yet their flapping also sounds like a challenge to the present. In the creaking timbers, the future listens, wrestling with how to carry forward stories that are at once glorious and brutal. The hands that restore her today shape more than wood. They shape memory, identity, and responsibility. Every rivet hammered in, every rope tied, is a step in the uneasy dance between history's shadow and the light of understanding. El Galleon moves through waters that once divided worlds, now crossing boundaries of culture and time, asking the living to reckon with what it means to remember. And so the ship rolls on, through waves and whispers, between past and present, refusing to be silent, refusing to be still. It invites those who dare to step aboard not just to witness history, but to feel its pulse, a pulse that beats with glory and grief, with wonder and warning, with the endless sea itself. Before the mast there is silence, not the calm kind, the kind that presses on the chest like a hand that will not move. The replica of the Amistad stands moored and still, but something pulses beneath its dark wood, something that cannot be varnished or smoothed away. The deck is clean, the ropes neatly coiled, but no amount of polish can quiet the memory of what once thundered in this shape. Footsteps do not echo here, they are swallowed, and every breath feels like it should be asked for. In 1839, this silhouette sailed under blood and steel. It carried not cargo, but bodies, bound, bruised, unnamed. Men captives torn from Sierra Leone, shackled by Spanish slavers, bought and sold like cattle. The original schooner was not built for freedom. It was built to silence it. But silence was shattered. On a night that split history in two, the enslaved rose. Knives in hands that had known only chains. Blood on the boards. Orders shouted in languages never meant to meet. Lives taken. Lives reclaimed. The mutiny was not chaos. It was a cry so powerful it cracked across oceans. The replica, built in 2000, holds that cry like thunder under its planks. Stand on its deck and feel it. Not the reenactment, not the script, but the raw tremor of defiance. There is no comfort here, only clarity. The sails rise like a scream. The hull groans under the weight of names never written down. You can walk its length and touch the railings, but the wood won't feel smooth. It will feel like memory. This is more than reconstruction. This is resistance nailed into shape. Shipwrights laid the keel not in celebration, but in grief and anger. Their tools carved through time. This was not a ship for display. It was protest in pine and oak. Every bolt twisted into place was an act of reverence, a refusal to forget. The labor was not commercial, It was ancestral. Black hands, white hands, calloused hands brought the Amistad back not to honor the slavers, but to honor those who said no. And that no still echoes. The replica sails today not for leisure, but for reckoning. She moves like a shadow and a lantern both. Wherever she docks, Connecticut, New York, the Caribbean, the wind seems to thicken around her. Schoolchildren board her gangway. Tourists, historians, descendants. And yet none of them can walk her decks without feeling watched. Because she does not belong to this century. She carries 1839 in her ribs. There is a spot on the deck, just aft of the mainmast, where the mutiny began. Sink stood there, not a slave, a leader. His hands still bear the ghost of iron. But his eyes were never broken. When he led the rebellion, he was not acting on rage alone. He was acting on dignity so unshakable it made gunpowder tremble. That spot on the replica? It doesn't creak. It hums. The museum docents sometimes speak softly when they reach that place, as if voices raised might wake something. Some visitors linger there. Others step quickly past. Some cry. Some stare hard at the deck, then look away. Because this is not just a teaching tool. It is a wound that breathes. The Amistad became a court case in 1841. The United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Africans' freedom. It was a legal victory, yes. But on the ship today, that verdict feels smaller than the blood that paid for it. The law followed after resistance. It did not lead it. Every judge's gavel in Washington still echoes with the crash of that first mutiny blow. Walk below decks and feel the darkness thicken. The cramped quarters, the stale air, the low beams, all faithfully built to replicate the ship's original belly. The place where men and women were kept like freight. It is a silence that drowns out breathing. Some visitors flinch. Some weep. Some leave. The replica does not care for comfort. It does not care for myth. It demands truth. Panels hang near the walls. Names, sketches, trial records. They tremble, almost, under the weight of what they represent. But the real story isn't printed. It lives in the tension between each plank, in the shadows that stretch too long, in the salt smell that feels too familiar. This is not the past neatly displayed. This is the past staring back. Shipbuilding, in this case, is not about admiration. It's about confrontation. This is history built to bite. The crew who sail her today know that. They speak of freedom and pain in the same sentence. They tell the truth without soft edges. Children are taught not to look away. Elders board slowly, solemnly. For many, this ship is not education, it's reflection. A mirror too large to ignore. There are no cannon salutes, no tales of glory. Only names that never had last names. Faces we only know from drawings. Voices that shook chains and still sang. In 2015, the replica returned to Cuba, the island where the original had been taken after the mutiny. Crowds gathered. Flags waved. But beneath the celebration was a trembling, unresolved grief. The Amistad was never just a ship. It was always a question. What are we willing to fight for? Who are we willing to remember? She still sails. Her mast cuts the sky. Her wake churns the water like a scar across time. She does not move quickly, but she does not stop. And wherever she sails, the air thickens with what cannot be forgotten. She is not here to soothe. She is here to speak. She speaks through wood, through shadow, through wind. And if you listen, not just with ears, but with memory, you will hear what she's saying. It will not be soft. It will not be clean, but it will be true, and you will not forget it. A hammer strikes steel at 3:17 a.m. The sound doesn't echo, it pulses. Low, final, like the heartbeat of a ship fighting to live. Around it, cold, silence, and the acrid scent of old rust mixed with oil. A dry dock in California. Lights hum overhead, casting long shadows on riveted plates that haven't felt seawater in decades. Men stand motionless, staring at the crack that runs like a scar through the hull. It's not just a break in metal, it's a wound in memory. This is not restoration. This is resuscitation. The ship in question, steel skeleton bared, deck stripped, layers of history peeled back with trembling care, is no longer a weapon of war or a vessel of trade. It is something stranger, something sacred, a floating archive of human breath and violence, held together by time and rust and a brutal will to preserve. You can smell the corrosion. It's sweet at the edge of your tongue, clinging to your lungs like the smoke of a forgotten fire. Steel doesn't rot like wood. It dies slowly, devoured molecule by molecule by oxygen and salt. It flakes away silently, turning strength into powder, memory into ash. And every ship that becomes a museum is constantly, endlessly dying. Preservation is not passive. It is war. Below the hull, scaffolding sways. Sparks bloom from welding torches, bright as gunfire. Gloves grip hot metal. Pressure gauges tremble. Even the walls seem to breathe with tension. There's no script here, only judgment. Where do you draw the line between authenticity and survival? Every bolt replaced, every beam re-welded, is a choice. Do you let the original material fade, or do you cut it out and replace it with something new, something strong enough to last? But then, is it still the same ship? Climate-controlled interiors protect engine rooms and sleeping quarters. Dehumidifiers hiss constantly, pulling decay out of the air. Some vessels have double hulls now. Others float in permanent cradles, denied even the touch of the sea that made them. Humidity sensors blink red in the corners like silent alarms. Visitors walk past, unaware that beneath their feet, time claws at every joint. The science is exacting. The ethics are anything but. Curators and engineers sit at long tables under flickering lights. One argues for original rivets, another for stainless steel replacements. Someone speaks of acid-free insulation, another warns of lead paint buried beneath cosmetic layers. They talk in low voices, as though the ship might hear them and object. Because these aren't just structures, they're stories, and each touch risks rewriting them. Every scar matters. Every dent left by a German shell, every burn from an engine room fire, every layer of flaking gray paint, they are fingerprints. Take them away, and you polish history into fiction. But let them stay, and the ship may not survive long enough to speak again. Outside, tourists line up. Cameras ready. Children laughing. They see a ship. A monument. They don't see the slow rot blooming behind the bulkheads, or the sleepless weeks of chemical analysis it takes to stop a hull from peeling into the sea. They don't feel the dread when a fresh leak appears in a welded seam that was supposed to hold another 50 years. Inside, archivists work with gloved hands. They catalog relics scraped from bilge compartments, buttons, canteens, boots half devoured by mold. These items are fragile, but their power is not. Each one crackles with silent screams. They are placed behind glass, not to be admired, but to be remembered. And the ship itself becomes an argument made of iron. What do we save, and why? Some want clean lines, perfect paint, gleaming decks, something noble, dignified. Others insist on rust, grime, cracked metal, the smell of diesel that never leaves. There is no answer, only tension, and every curator must walk it, barefoot, through oil and time. Because the truth is this: preservation is violence. It is the refusal to let death do its work. It is hands clawing history back from the abyss. It is the hammer strike at 3:17 a.m., waking ghosts who should have been left to drift. It is every engineer standing over a rotting beam, whispering a prayer not to God, but to memory. And there is no rest. Even when the hull gleams. Even when the decks shine. Even when the audio guides speak in polished voices, telling half-truths with careful grace. The fight never ends. Climate change brings higher humidity. Storm surges slam into museum docks. Rising seas mock the very notion of permanence. But the ships stay, because they must. They are not dead things. They are breathing archives. Each one is a living wound stitched with stories. Floating not on water, but on the ache of those who will not forget. Their presence is not comfortable, it is necessary. They speak of what war smells like, of what peace costs, of what rust remembers when humans forget. And when a child runs a hand along a cold railing and asks why the metal feels like it's shivering, no one answers. Because the ship knows. And the fight continues. Understood. I'm ready for the next section when you are. Just give me the title or topic and I'll continue the experience. The air is thick, heavy, not with the salt of the sea, but with silence that presses down like an invisible weight. The deck beneath your feet creaks, but the sound seems swallowed by a quiet, so dense it almost feels sacred. Around you, polished brass gleams, immaculate wood stretches out like the pages of a carefully preserved book. Flags flutter above, bold and unyielding, each a banner of a story told, and many untold. The ship, once a vessel of war, a guardian of borders, a bearer of conquest, now floats as a monument, a storyteller with only one voice loud enough to be heard. But whose voice? Whose story? Steel and would carry the echoes of sailors who marched to the rhythm of commands, but also the ghosts of those silenced, those forgotten. Nationalism breathes in the gunmetal shine and the freshly painted rails. It whispers in the proud plaques naming battles, in the uniforms preserved behind glass. It promises pride and unity, but underneath, an undercurrent churns, questions, doubts, fractures that ripple beneath the surface. On board these preserved ships, history is not neutral. It is curated. Narratives are crafted, polished until they gleam like the brass cannons lined up on the gun decks. Military glory is celebrated with grand ceremony, flags raised, speeches given, names etched into honor rolls. The roar of victory still seems to echo in the corridors. Yet, behind the shine, tension coils, unease about what is left in the shadows. The quiet stories of the oppressed, the colonized, the defeated. The stories of those who saw these ships not as symbols of pride, but as harbingers of loss and subjugation. In places like Portsmouth or Boston, Sydney or Manila, these floating monuments stand as icons of national identity, reminders of power, courage, sacrifice. They are preserved to inspire patriotism, to hold fast to the memory of battles won, lives given. But these battles were never clean. They were brutal, bloodied, complex. And yet, the display rarely lets you see that fully. The gloss of nationalism covers the cracks, conceals the pain. The 21st century presses against these stories, refusing to accept the neatness of old narratives. The ship museum becomes a battleground itself, where voices clash, between those who demand unvarnished truth and those who fear losing the comfort of heroic myths. Indigenous groups challenge the grand tales of maritime empires, pointing to the blood spilled on distant shores, the uprooting of communities, the theft of cultures. Post-colonial critics stand firm, unafraid to confront the glorification of conquest wrapped in proud flags and ringing gun salutes. Walking down narrow passageways, you can feel the weight of this struggle. The ship is both archive and battlefield. Signs proclaim valor. Elsewhere, quieter displays acknowledge pain and complexity. It's a delicate dance, sometimes uneasy, between celebration and critique. The ship breathes with conflicting histories, echoes of patriotism mingled with the shadows of colonization. Visitors pass through with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Some seek to honor ancestors who sailed these decks with pride, their hearts swelling at tales of bravery. Others come bearing questions, their footsteps tentative on planks that once bore the march of empires. They wonder why certain stories remain untold, why some voices are louder than others. They trace their fingers along the cold metal railings and sense the stories trapped beneath, stories waiting, demanding to be heard. The pressure of the past pushes against the present in every creak, every polished surface. Museums try to navigate these treacherous waters, balancing education with reverence, spectacle with truth. Exhibitions evolve, sometimes haltingly, to include critical perspectives, those of the colonized, the exploited, the silenced. Interpretive panels shift tone, museums invite dialogue, but the ship itself remains a potent symbol, stubborn and unyielding. Flags fly in proud salute, but beneath them linger the ghosts of histories contested and incomplete. The hull that once sliced through oceans for empire now holds a mirror up to identity, complex, fractured, raw. How does a nation honor its past without erasing its scars? How does a floating museum carry the weight of pride while bearing the burden of critique? The tension simmers just beneath the surface, a current that pulls and pushes. This ship is no longer just wood and steel. It is a vessel of memory, but memory is a contested sea. It laps at the edges of identity, threatening to erode the comfortable narratives. And yet, the stories cling fiercely, insistent as barnacles on the hull, refusing to be washed away. Every visitor who steps aboard becomes part of this uneasy dialogue. They hear the cheers and the silence. They feel the pride and the ache. They stand in the very place where history was made, and where history is still being fought over. The ship waits, silent and imposing, a floating emblem of the past's grip on the present. a constant reminder that history is never settled. The deck stretches out, unchanging, but beneath it, currents shift. Nationalism, memory, critiques swirl like an ocean storm. Violent, uncertain, unstoppable. The ship remains, caught between celebration and reckoning. Its timbers soaked in stories both told and untold. Its voice a haunting echo that refuses to fade away. Under a sky split between stormlight and silence, a gangway groans against the tide. A museum ship lies still in the harbor, timeless, or pretending to be. Inside, everything waits. The engine room hums with memories no longer mechanical. Decks echo with the sound of feet that are no longer there. You stand on wood that once crossed oceans. Now, it watches the sea rise around it. Salt creeps into the seams like prophecy. And then, silence breaks. Not with sound, but with light. A child lifts a headset to their eyes, and the past erupts into the present. The decks fill with ghostly figures. Sailors move with purpose. Smoke coils from a funnel that hasn't burned coal in 50 years. The ship wakes, not through rusted machinery, but through light and signal, code and illusion. It is a memory made visible, stitched together from scans and fragments, rebuilt inside the machines we carry in our pockets. A digital resurrection. Augmented reality doesn't whisper, it commands. It overlays the present with what was once true. A turret turns. A voice calls orders in the language of a dead fleet. You can see the moment a torpedo was fired, frozen in time, looping endlessly on the same stretch of steel. But nothing physical has moved. The rust remains. The paint still peels in the quiet places no tour guide shows. For those who cannot climb ladders or step across narrow hatches, the ship can come to them now. In bedrooms, in classrooms, in wheelchairs. Every bolt and beam is mapped, every rivet preserved in data. Yet even as the experience broadens, something slips away. Something tactile, something stubborn. The smell of diesel trapped in the grain of iron. The scrape of steel under a worn boot. The ache of distance is softened, but the cost is touch. Outside, the harbor itself grows restless. The sea, once the ship's highway, has become its threat. The waters rise year by year. Storms bite harder, longer. In Charleston, in Manila, in Rotterdam, mooring lines strain against the wind. Pilings rot faster than they can be replaced. Salt eats through heritage like acid. Climate change is not an abstract menace to these floating survivors. It is already here, clawing at the hull, climbing the bilge, pushing ships against keys with unnatural tides. In 2020, a storm surge in Galveston lifted a museum ship just inches from disaster. In Venice, groundwater surges through stone. In Yokosuka, restoration plans quietly include flood mitigation, though few speak openly of the creeping sea. The future is not kind to steel and timber left afloat. And still the preservationists fight. Dry docks become sanctuaries, climate control becomes religion. Dehumidifiers were with the solemnity of prayer. Some ask, should all of this be saved? When maintenance costs rise into millions, when politics change, when younger generations no longer know the names etched into hulls, what do we preserve and why? Not every ship can be saved. Some will fade, scrapped, scuttled, forgotten. But others will remain, transformed. Some will be reduced to wireframes, blueprints rendered in VR. Others will become digital shadows, walked not with feet, but with fingertips on glass. In time, even emotion may be programmed into the experience. A chill as you pass the brig, a jolt as the engines roar alive. Real and unreal blur. The soul of the ship, once its crew, now flickers in code. And yet, in the quiet corners of some exhibits, rust is allowed to show. There, visitors pause longer. They run their fingers along it, feel its grain, and something clicks. A kind of honesty. The passage of time, not hidden, but honored. History not frozen, but aging, like flesh, like memory. There is power in letting ships grow old, visibly. Not everything must be glossy. Not every exhibit needs touchscreens. Some truths lie in decay. And still, the question lingers, weightless and sharp as fog. When we step aboard a ship frozen in time, are we preserving its story, or writing our own onto its bones? The wind picks up again. Rain taps the deck. Somewhere, water seeps into a crack that should have been sealed. Somewhere, a sensor pings a warning. A curator will read it in the morning. A patch will be applied. A tour will go on as planned. But the ocean waits. Not angry. Not patient. Certain.